Hello and thanks for tuning in. My name's Carbon Mike, and we're here doing a Sunday session with Ben Pyle and Simon Roberts on the 2004 documentary, The Power of Nightmares. And I'm going to, without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Simon Roberts, who's going to moderate this discussion for us.
For nearly 30 years, over more than a dozen major documentaries produced for the BBC, Adam Curtis has mapped stories of our relation to power through the multivarious lenses of scientific rationalism and curated memory in series like Pandora's Box and The Living Dead, the rakish capitalist adventurism of the Mayfair set and the ascendancy of psychiatry and politics and the PR industry in The Century of the Self, the struggles between social engineering, political managerialism, and the emergence of technocratic utopianism in The Trap, and all watched over by machines of loving grace, to later, more complex and darkly immersive visual essays such as Bitter Lake and Hypernormalization, which sought to capture both an emotional impressionism and an epic aerial sweep over the historical and economic trauma of the late 20th, early 21st centuries, post-9/11 geopolitics, propaganda, and the simultaneous collapse of comprehension in societies, having run out of, in Curtis's view, grand overarching stories to tell themselves about themselves. In all of these, Curtis not only plots the story arcs of familiar big historical figures, but also reveals the often hitherto unknown and subtler bit-part players of astonishing consequence, whether it is the mild-mannered Jim Slater with his train-spotterish study of Monopoly game stats in the Mayfair set, the phenomenally influential but unremarkable and dull-looking Edward Bernays in The Century of the Self, or the oddball cult figure of libertarian hyper-individualism in Ayn Rand in All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. Curtis meshes his multi-strand psychogeographies together through hypnotic montage by feats of obscure but apt archive retrieval, mixing interstitial footage of unused news VT, dissector membra of pop culture references from films, TV and nature documentaries, layered amidst a soundtrack of atmospheric eclecticism, by turns ominous, grandiose, exhilarating, or with archly comic cuts of Ennio Morricone, Shostakovich, Brian Eno, John Carpenter horror soundtracks, Stereo Total, Nine Inch Nails, or Burial. All right, that's the unapologetically intense fanboy introduction to the Curtis oeuvre. And now I'd like to introduce those joining me for the chat tonight. We have Ben Pyle. Ben is a skeptic of environmental politics and scientism. He's a contributing writer to Spiked since 2006. He's a blogger at climate-resistance.org since 2007 and a Twitterer since 2009 at Clim8Resistance. That's CLIM 8 Resistance. More recently, he's a YouTuber. And Carbon Mike started Foundationism, which is an American political movement, broadly speaking. It's the politics of people who build things for a living. Our beliefs fall outside the boundaries of traditional left-right politics. We are conservative about some issues and liberal about others, say the Foundationists. We are secular but friendly to believers. We're forward-looking but respectful of tradition. So, leaping straight in, we've got our first clip from The Power of Nightmares, which we'll play now.
In the past, politicians promised to create a better world. They had different ways of achieving this, but their power and authority came from the optimistic visions they offered their people. Those dreams failed, and today, people have lost faith in ideologies. Increasingly, politicians are seen simply as managers of public life. But now, they have discovered a new role that restores their power and authority. Instead of delivering dreams, politicians now promise to protect us from nightmares. They say that they will rescue us from dreadful dangers that we cannot see and do not understand. And the greatest danger of all is international terrorism, a powerful and sinister network with sleeper cells in countries across the world. A threat that needs to be fought by a war on terror. But much of this threat is a fantasy, which has been exaggerated and distorted by politicians. It's a dark illusion that has spread unquestioned through governments around the world, security services, and the international media. This is a series of films about how and why that fantasy was created and who it benefits. At the heart of the story are two groups, the American neoconservatives and the radical Islamists. Last week's episode ended in the late 90s, with both groups marginalized and out of power. But with the attacks on September the 11th, the fates of both dramatically changed. The Islamists, after their moment of triumph, were virtually destroyed within months, while the neoconservatives took power in Washington. But then, the neoconservatives began to reconstruct the Islamists. They created a phantom enemy. And as this nightmare fantasy began to spread, politicians realized the new power it gave them in a deeply disillusioned age. Those with the darkest nightmares became the most powerful.
So, jumping off from there, Ben Pyle, we were talking about. On the one hand, it's kind of the most balls-achingly obvious thing to talk about this as extremely relevant in the light of, especially the announcements last night from Boris Johnson about, again, the continuation of this current crisis by the sort of furious stoking of yet more convenient fictions for the political class. But we mused, didn't we, before coming on, that Curtis actually at the very end of the series tells us that he thinks, as he says, quote, "But the fear will not last, and just as the dreams that politicians once promised turned out to be illusions, so too will the nightmares, and then our politicians will have to face the fact that they have no visions, either good or bad, to offer us any longer." Do you think that sentiment stands up after 17 years, or are we still trapped in the power of nightmares? It very much seems like we are.
Yeah, of course it does. Yeah, many people, I think, probably have observed that the critique of biopolitics, the sort of that was produced by postmodernists in the 1970s, became an instruction manual to fearmongers, and I think that's true of this as well. Whereas we sort of may have had our head in our hands and sort of gone, "Oh wow, what WTF? What's happened?" Some people seem to have watched The Power of Nightmares and thought, "What a fantastic idea!" And let's see how much further we can push this, because there doesn't see that critique isn't rare. Curtis wasn't the only person to make it. It wasn't unique to the 2000s, nor the 1990s, nor the 1980s. And at least it was happening in the 1970s. We could see that in people making those comments in the 1970s. So they must be aware of what they're doing, and seeing how much further they can take things.
Carbon Mike, it's I think it's for you. Ben and I think, are both probably massive fanboys of Adam Curtis. I think that's fair to say. And this is your first exposure to Curtis's work, and I'm interested to find out what you make of this from the US perspective, especially as a New Yorker, someone who was there when 9/11 was sort of unfolding in front of you. What did you think of it?
Good question. Yeah, I'm a newcomer to Curtis's work, and the very first time I heard about either him or this film was when I was bending Ben's ear, just talking about something I was annoyed about, and he mentioned this film, and immediately I went and looked it up and started watching, and I was mesmerized. What's interesting to me about watching that film this many years later, and yes, I'm a native New Yorker. I was in New York on 9/11. I actually rode my bike into Manhattan after the attacks on the towers, because I had a friend who lived in Lower Manhattan, and I was going to see if he needed assistance to get out with his pets or what have you. So I actually, it's real to me in a way that in which it's perhaps more abstract to people who just saw it, who just saw the actual events on television. I mean, I can remember, streams of people coming across the bridge, and I started to see people with dust on their faces and what have you, and then, people with blood on their faces, and literally people, streaming out of Manhattan. Okay, so, what are my thoughts? What's funny is, in 2001, I hadn't really begun my journey away from the left. So I was still very much of the left. I was still at least somewhat friendly to conspiratorial thinking in general. And when those events happened, and when American policy pivoted as it did, I remember I hadn't known about the players, the neoconservatives at that time. I'd read some literature later about Leo Strauss and the Straussians and what have you, but I didn't know all the players. I didn't know who Said Qutb was, et cetera, et cetera. But it struck me that the swiftness of the United States policy pivot was odd, right? Was that this thing seemingly came out of nowhere, and all of a sudden there was an intellectual framework seemingly to understand it. They were talking about all these players whose names I hadn't heard before, right? And this was like either that day or the next day they were talking about Osama bin Laden and what have you. It's like, well, whoa, how was it that, we've never heard about these guys, and all of a sudden they took a title shot, but how, and we never heard you talk about them. So that's so even then, there were things that struck me as odd, and what was interesting about seeing the film is that it connected a lot of those dots for me. It turns out that, in fact, there was an intellectual framework, a policy framework, of people who were ready to push that policy framework, operating in the halls of power, waiting to take their title shot, so to speak, to get back in the spotlight. So that's something that really struck me as I was watching it. And then the other things I've been thinking a lot about illusion versus unreality, as you guys know, because we were talking in preparation for this thing. But I'm going to pause there. That's the number one thing that I took away. That now as then you can get a sense of things moving under the surface. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is just sort of if we start ambling lightly through the kind of themes of the first episode, "Baby, It's Cold Outside." The interesting thing is that weirdly, it's not the Middle East or the nations of Islam in the Middle East that are the focus here. Really, the whole thing emerges out of two responses to America, don't they? It's on the one hand, it's the fundamental Islamist. It's Said Qutb is a teacher, an Egyptian school teacher who visits America in the late 40s, and he travels around making observations of what he sees to be the inner corruption at the heart of America, the sort of failure of the liberal dream, as Curtis expresses it. At the same time, or just about the same time, you've got Leo Strauss, who's a political philosopher in Chicago, who himself is about, as Curtis presents it, at least. I've done a little bit more reading on Strauss in the interim, so it's slightly different from how Curtis does present it. He himself is looking to form a kind of influential vanguard elite, as you might say, with regards to the next generation of political actors in America. And in so doing, he talks about, as Curtis relates, asserting a need for binding myths, and in particular, religion and nation. Now, he sees the potential for America as a country with, great power and science and technology, and he wants to translate this back to Egypt as a model for a kind of a government with Islam at the heart of it, but also a strong and modern capability. But the thing about this, as I say, is it's about the sense of America, the response to America in decay. And yet, of course, we're looking at the footage that Curtis provides of seemingly benign Americana from the 50s.
Yes.
How does that? How do you relate to that, Mike? How do you see that? I mean, was it a mythic time? Was it a time where people were actually genuinely unhappy in some way at some deep level? This is what Qutb identifies as he's trawling around, Greeley in Colorado, I think it is.
Yeah, Greeley, Colorado. What is interesting to me about that is, I mean, look when I looked at that, when I watched that part of the movie, one thing that struck me was that, well, this is a thoroughly nasty little man. That's the first thing. Like, what an asshole. And then I also thought that he did have a point about a fly in the ointment of American life, right? This was 1950s. What was the decade?
1949.
1949, right? So all was not well with America in that year. I mean, even factoring out racial and ethnic turmoil that was rife in certainly some parts of the countries more than others. But all was not well with America during that time. And so fly in the ointment. But he came here and he seemed to see fly ointment. he seemed to see it like everything was terrible to him. And it struck me that the problem with him was fundamentally a spiritual emptiness that he had, and a kind of a. And as I'm hearing him talk, I'm hearing Adam Curtis talk about Sayyid Qutb. I'm thinking, right, about our modern version of that, which is they're not motivated by Islam, they're not motivated by a recognized religion, but they are also in the grip of religious fervor, and they also look around and see nothing but horror, right? They see nothing but decay and what have you, and the Black Lives Matter of the world, the Antifas of the world, this kind of radical rejectionism, right? What strikes me about Qutb and people like him is that none of them take a systems approach. None of them take the approach of saying, of starting with gratitude, starting with wonder, starting with curiosity. He didn't strike me as very curious about American life. It's almost like he knew everything he wanted to know, and he just thought it was terrible, and he thought that, high school kids dancing cheek to cheek at a dance, which to me is in light of current culture, is the most innocent thing you could possibly imagine. And everything was just terrible. Everything stank of lust because he was a thoroughly nasty little man. And I noticed this, it seems to be like a psychological thread that runs through the thinking of a lot of rejectionists, whether you talk about Greenpeace, the Extinction Rebellion, the people, everything, that they have this kind of dour Calvinist rejection of the world as fundamentally bad, and that seems that is the thing that struck me most viscerally when I watched that footage.
I mean, the thing you've got in this series is it's sort of like it sort of ends. I mean, like a lot of Curtis documentaries, the one prior has led to the next one. I think this comes after The Century of the Self, which he did earlier, which was about the influence of Freud and then Edward Bernays in the development of politics and the development, I should say, of PR, and then its later infiltration into politics in the US and in Britain as well. And it's in this case where we start with Power of Nightmares. It's that moment where a deep cultural reaction meets the liberal desire and decay, as you say, of the kind of white picket fence America at that period. I think the interesting thing about what we find out about Strauss in his reaction to this is, as I say, this notion of these myths that need to be deployed in order to counter this, and in particular, this sort of idea of the noble lie that comes up. that on the one hand, the funny anecdote is that Strauss is fascinated by a couple of particular TV shows. In one case, it's Gunsmoke, the classic kind of, white hat cowboy meets black hat cowboy, good, evil morality tale, which he thinks needs to be part of the cultural deployment for ordinary people. And at the same time, he's telling the elite class that he's cultivating to be more like a kind of Perry Mason, the crafty lawyer, deploying his rhetoric and his skills to on the one hand give people the leading kind of myth of the basic American good versus evil exceptionalism that we see expressed later, and to say at the same time to the elites, you can cultivate your own kind of private morality here, regardless, as long as it doesn't intrude into your public positioning. And the thing that Qutb then focuses on is the sense of what they call jahiliyyah. This false consciousness, which he sees as the kind of corrosive threat to Islam that has come because of American liberalism being translated over to Egypt through the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who wants to have a sort of secular government under U.S. influence. Ben, what's your reaction to this?
Well, just to carry on from what you and Mike were talking about a moment ago, that was a big. The sort of span of that first episode was sort of compressed quite a lot from 49 to around 66, which is quite a it's immediately in the aftermath of the Second World War, and its and its fallout, and into that sort of liberal order of the late 60s, where there was experiments with policies that liberals had advanced and that had seemed to have failed by that time.
This was LBJ's Great Society project, which is. Do you know about a bit about this, Mike, at all? Because I think we talked about this in passing in the past. There was a series of spending programs that were designed to address various things like education and medical care, rural poverty, stuff like that. Yeah.
Yes, correct. So there, yes. And fundamentally, the problem was that many of the issues that the Great Society programs were designed to address, of course, it ended up making worse. And regardless of the intentions behind them, it's arguable that some of the intentions behind the Great Society were cynical, in that, well, we're gonna get these people stuck on federal money. And in other words, a giant vote buying program. It's possible to look at it as having only been that. The longer I live, the more I tend to see problems as being overdetermined. So I think that was a big part of it. I think there was some notion of having to tackle these problems in a serious way, because there was pervasive poverty in some parts of the United States. And when I say poverty, I don't mean I don't know the mild kind we see now. I mean people literally not having enough to eat. Not like it is now, where actually substantial portions of our poor population are actually overweight. It wasn't like that back then, and it wasn't just urban America. It was also rural America. So, yes. Long story short, there was this well-intentioned, let's say, set of programs put in place, and many of those programs ended up having the opposite of their desired effect. And in any case, what they did was they made it more. They made a federal government that was larger, more intrusive. There was more of a financial incentive to interfere in private life, and in so doing, kind of destroy many of the things that are properly the province of private life and family and community interactions. So rambling a bit there, I'll pause. But yes, it's funny. At the time, again, years ago, well, let's say when 9/11 had happened, I had this notion that conservatives who were always attacking the Great Society were just in the grip of whatever, whatever madness. But I think if I could just go back a little bit, it strikes me that all of these, and again, I'm thinking about these things as a foundationist, is that all of the players we've talked about so far strike me as being fundamentally kind of rootless. When I say rootless, I mean they're not. They don't have enough of a they don't understand the foundation that they themselves stand on, and so everything they plan is almost it's almost like the setup for a great Shakespearean tragedy. Everything's bound to fail. Like Saeed Qutb doesn't understand. He's only, because he's such a small man, and because he doesn't really have a grasp on systems thinking, all he can see is, people are lustful, and this thing which they pretend is perfect is not perfect. He didn't really, it doesn't strike me that he thought deeply about things like abundance and logistics and supply chains and design engineering, and why exactly America seemed to be so prosperous and was and could bring so much mass to the fight, economically speaking. Separate from your cultural critiques, he seemed to be very narrow. And then you had Strauss, who was fundamentally, he was about power, but it never struck me that he had a clear understanding of what power was for. Okay, the actual purpose. He had a couple of narrow ideas, and he had a very kind of ruthless way to him, and he had some loyal acolytes, but he never, his ideas, his framework struck me as fundamentally irreligious, and we can get more into that later. And then LBJ, same thing. It's like they never seem to understand what society, it's the Great Society. Well, what is society for? What is mankind for? And of course, these are not the kinds of things that Washington officials tend to think about, which is part of the problem. Sorry, go on.
It's interesting you should say that. I mean, because what I'm reading from this is, as you go through the episode, you introduce these sort of characters, these alumni of Strauss's teaching. People like Crystal, senior and junior, Paul Wolfowitz, even Francis Fukuyama. I didn't know he'd gone on through Strauss. Yeah. The end of history chap, as we all know. Yes. And I mean, what they were about was kind of actually a very deeply moral vision, but it was about reinvigorating a kind of US exceptionalism. And the interesting thing I want to put to you and to Ben, as a matter of fact, is I remember when the series came out, obviously, we're in the wake of 9/11 and then, the Iraq War. And the invasion of Afghanistan, and the neocons are by that point they've lived long enough to see themselves become the villains. It's at this point in The Power of Nightmares he introduces the notion of the neocons being sort of on the make towards Washington, towards the centers of power, and they hit the figure of Henry Kissinger, and this is the interesting sort of clash here that Curtis draws this very firm line that the neocons are these hugely young and energetic and idealistic young men, and they meet Kissinger, who is the realpolitik Machiavellian, who's talking in terms of quote a truly global society. The weird thing at the time this documentary came out was, of course, I remember people in reviews and critiques saying, "Oh, isn't it strange? Kissinger's almost coming across as the hero here because he's setting out to thwart the neocons." Ben, do you remember that?
I remember the film, obviously. As to people's comments, and people's comments about Power of Nightmares were varied in their quality. Adam Curtis became a hero because I think he was. Mike and I were talking about this the other day, because he was sort of ostensibly anti-war, but just as Mike was explaining there, people not knowing what. That's not enough. You've got to know why you're anti-war.
Yes.
And it becomes an almost tribal thing for some people, that you can have quite a low quality critique and people will rally around it and rally behind it as long as it seems popular for just that reason, that it fulfills some sort of disgust of the war in them. So I mean, and the sort of epitome of that would have been but this really does speak to Mike's point. the anti-war movement rallying around the slogan "Not in my name"
Right.
was the most pathetic display. I mean, it was little wonder that the governments don't respond to their public when despite there being 1 million people on the streets apparently saying that this war was wrong, with no real intention to go any further. It's like the dog that catches the squirrel doesn't really know what to do with it when it's got it. A huge movement, like bigger than any political party, massive potential to turn it to something, but didn't. Yeah. It's almost a tragedy, almost just a symbolic gesture in and of itself. Yeah. This running into this conflict between the Kissingers and the Straussians, I think was an attempt. I mean, I think that's something that's only I've really sort of cottoned on to relatively recently as well. The sort of there was the notion of the neocons as being an ever-present force that had just in American politics that some good people had lost to. And that sort of has often, as a recovering green leftoid myself, probably at the time, that would have been invisible to me. The notion that there was any complexity to the right of centre argument would have been almost a stupid point to my ears at the time. So and further removed from it by being British as well, not being connected to the States. So it's an interesting thing to see that there was a conflict between two equally nasty sides. Well, more than two. You've got the Rumsfeld movement, the Straussian movement, and you've got Qutb and that stuff developing over there, and then bringing in the Dems. I mean, we learn since as we recover from being leftoid environmentalists, we discover the Democrats weren't much to celebrate either. Exactly. So very binary views of politics, especially US politics, from these shores get disintegrated, in turn, and disintegrated further and further. And so I'm not going to punish people now, retroactively for not getting it, because I didn't get it either. Even with the benefit of watching the film in 2004. I mean, it's a complex and long film, but so I'll give them some slack, if you like.
Well, as you're talking, Ben, I keep circling back to the thing that I've probably bent your ear about before, which is the whole fallacy opposition thing. My half-assed theory that the Cold War was this tremendously destructive thing to American politics in general. It destroyed our ability to think reasonably about certain things. It strikes me that this fallacy of opposition is all over the place here. In other words, it's Saeed Qutb, thoroughly unpleasant man, and has some really bad ideas. He is opposed by a bunch of thoroughly unpleasant people who also have really bad ideas. In other words, the opposite of a bad idea is very often not a good idea. It's simply another bad idea that's bad in the opposite direction. Okay? And this is, having started to think about this, and really that got sparked off by reading C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis famously said that the adversary sends enemies into the world two at a time as pairs of opposites. And he sends deceptions into the world in this way so that as you lurch back from the one, you stumble into the other. And now that having been attuned to that and having gotten on board with that, I see that everywhere. Big state, meaning socialism, communism, and big capital are not in fact opposites; they're kissing cousins. Islamic radicalism and this notion of overarching state power are also not really opposites. The neocons weren't really the opposites of the radical Islamists, even though they opposed them in some sense. But it strikes me that I'll just say briefly that I watched this film very much in a spirit of, this is interesting. This is a kind of thing that happens. We're watching a design pattern play out. How do we avoid these kinds of outcomes in the future? How do we become better at reasoning about reality, reasoning about politics, thinking about how to retaliate against our very real enemies? How do we get better at that without falling into this nonsense fallacy of opposition? And this goes directly to your work, Ben, with climate, climate resistance, the kind of stuff we're seeing with pharmaceutical hysteria and kind of biohysteria, the industrialization and the weaponization of the COVID freak out. I mean, it all comes down to one's ability to kind of face things and reason honestly about them, and that's what really strikes me from this.
So the binary opposites thing is what I think really that it speaks to me. The film really speaks to me about I mean, that it's the premise of it, of course, that the two sides make each other. But yes, it is remarkable that there is this synthesis very quickly, seemingly to challenge the problems of relativism. The Straussians and the Kissingers find agreement very quickly. In fact, the terrorists and the neocons find an agreement very quickly. So essentially, what I take from all of them is that it's not just Qutb and his followers who believe in Jahiliyyah. That's very much the basis from which the neocons, the Straussians, are all operating from. The necessity of regulating individuals through myths is an elite preoccupation. Yes. That's been in motion at least since then and to now. And I read them, and I do think so. Kamel Habib said in the film, psychologically we thought we were superior to reality. We despised the everyday vision of the world, and we wanted to transform or change its reality. And I'm thinking all the time, and there are a number of quotes, I probably won't bore you with them, but I just think George Monbiot, the insulate. They say the masses failed to rise up. Well, that's in Insulate Britain. Like these kind of there's very much on both sides of the story, essentially aristocrats having great ideas about how society must be reorganized, and once they've sort of made these gestures, and got the ball rolling on their grand projet, the masses are going to follow them. Like Osama bin Laden is a classic playboy who sort of discovers he's sort of entitled to something or believes himself.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And not for nothing, people have called Eton a green Al Qaeda training camp.
Wow, that's rough.
Yeah. So it speaks to a dynamic, I think, of people believing themselves to be entitled to occupy a place in a natural order of things.
Yes.
With near the top. That's probably off the topic of the film in this conversation.
Not quite. I think this is part of what interests me about this part of this first episode, where you get into this stuff of Team B. This was the neocons forming a think tank to, essentially kind of invert the findings to redefine certainty by a lack of visible evidence when it came to considering, the purported enemy, the Soviet Union at that time. Of course, it is the enemy at that time, but they begin to wildly overestimate the capability in the Soviet Union by claiming that the fact that the CIA is saying there's no evidence of these guys having all of these astonishing technological capabilities, that in itself is evidence of the sophistication of their attack on us. You know, it's the invisible enemy again. It becomes instantiated in something called the Committee for the Present Danger to lobby Washington for, you know, more power to the Team B side, and to people like Richard Pipes, this academic who is a sort of expert on the Soviet mindset, he says. So it's interesting that you've got that contrast between Qutb, you know, trying to do this through, I suppose, you know, the simple means of inspirational revolutionary ideology, and the Western powers, if you like, with their ability to create institutionalized testing grounds and means of processing this kind of myth making, if you like. They can form committees, they can form lobbying groups, they can have think tanks, and this is the thing that sort of distinguishes us in this way. I think an interesting point also in this is part of the documentary is you've got this thing that Curtis often uses. You've got what I call one of his anchor voices who comes in. He's got this Professor Stephen Holmes who comes in, who describes what was happening with the neocons at that time, and Holmes himself is a law professor at I think at NYU. And you know, Curtis never explicitly states his point of view, but you begin to realize once you look into Holmes, he's a man who's authored books like The Anatomy of Anti-Liberalism, and The Light That Failed, which was the idea that you know, democracy didn't take off in Eastern Europe because it was overwhelmed by populist xenophobia that happened after the wall came down. So he's definitely very, very liberal, this guy, and he explains everything in that period. What's interesting here, though, is this sense in which Qutb goes back to Egypt, and he notices that you know, American influence is beginning to come in, and you've got these very, very funny sort of clips. I mean, they're from much later, but you see the sorts of clips of adverts from Egypt in the 70s, which are shot in a way just almost to make Egypt and Egyptians seem like they're from California. You know, blonde-haired children, you know, blonde women talking about Snoopy and cooking products and stuff like that. So it's interesting that that idea of U.S. cultural penetration that is happening at the same time as the neocons are sort of wrapping themselves up in this desire to kind of, you know, invert reality to the extent that it makes the case for attacking the Soviet Union.
Well, you know what's funny about this is that, you know, liberalism. I'm watching my notes and some of the comments in the chats. What was it? Bolero 393 said liberalism is moral syphilis. I think that's
a quote from Jonathan Bowden, by the way.
Oh, that's awesome. That's good stuff.
Yeah.
But what strikes me is that, again, these guys, for example, Saeed Qutb was not animated by oikophilia, by a love of home. He didn't have a foundation. He was animated by something he saw that terrified him or that disgusted him. In other words, he was animated by hatred and scorn. Now, I have nothing against hatred and scorn. They are fine emotions. They can be very useful, okay? But that's the problem. And the you know, watching the films, the one thing that I hadn't even known, a reality I hadn't known about, which Curtis mentions in the film, is that these radical Islamists in their home countries, like their revolutions, and they were kind of like more than one attempt to start a revolution. Their revolutions were all damp squibs. Like, it didn't go off. Like, people weren't having it. And this is in Muslim countries, okay? And the reason they kind of amp themselves up to kind of higher levels of kind of almost bestial violence toward their own people is because their own people weren't having it. They were like, no, listen, we can, you know, we'll work it out, right? And now, flipping the script, looking at these neocons, you know, fundamentally they weren't. It doesn't seem to me that they were animated. I mean, you could say that liberalism is not a good thing, but what I'm saying is these guys were animated by a hatred of liberalism. They weren't animated by love of home. They were animated by love of power, and love of power is a passion to be regulated. And so I'll pause because I want to get you guys' take on this. But it seems to me that the fundamental problem with these guys is one that neither of them is standing on a foundation. Neither camp is standing on a good foundation. Okay, they are chaotic. They are internally chaotic to begin with because they don't know what they are and who they are and why they are. And the problem with the Straussians especially is a love of power unmediated by virtue. It's a foreign policy that is irreligious, in that there is no religion in it. That is, yeah, they mention Christianity, but what I mean is their values are not structured. They just know they don't like liberalism, and that's not good enough.
It seems like there's something lost in the translation, at least between Strauss and how his students develop, doesn't it? Because I mean, this is one of the things that struck me towards the end of that first episode, is you have, the initial context of this is all about a reactionary take on the liberal decay of America, and then by the end you've got an academic like Michael Ledeen, who is kind of one of the sort of cheerleaders for the neocons as we get into the 80s with Reagan, saying, we're all about freedom, we always have been. And there's the irony, they started with the attack on liberal hyper-individualism, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, we're going to, we're coming in to force you all to be free, and that's part of the project. But they confuse, as we see sort of later on when they go into Afghanistan, they confuse the idea of us talking about freedom with the desire of countries that exist in a state of native reaction, if you like, to absorb and inhabit democracy. I think the sequelae they think from freedom is democracy, isn't it? Well, that's the great sort of problem here.
Well, that's one of the problems. I mean, I would say that. So you're talking about, freedom. Well, freedom itself does not. Liberty has no content. Liberty is not an end state. It's a set of potentialities, if you like. You have to come better than just wanting liberty. Liberty to do what? What are you for? What is mankind for? What is the purpose of, democracy? Same thing. Democracy is an instrument. And these guys never seem to understand that. They seem to think of democracy as
they've not got a complex theory of what democracy is. It's just a it's just a noun. And that's implied in by the idea of necessary myths.
Yes, pious lies. Yes.
Yeah, right. So you can just sort of publish.
You get a great example of that, if I just cut across slightly, where you've got the footage of Ayman al-Zawahiri on trial in Egypt in the late 70s. He's part of, I think, Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And he's talking about Islam as ideology and practice. But this is the interesting thing. Curtis then cuts in and tells you, from one of his commentators, but he comes from an aristocratic family himself.
Right.
So I mean, tying in with one of our watchers, academic agent here, again, it's top-down elite insurgency that's being preached here. It's never ground up.
That's right.
And not to be sympathetic to him as such, but the experiences that maybe come later on in the sequence of films, they do see through democracy as Western democracy as a sham. There's those guys, the Zahais and co. It is made plain to them that it's not democracy that's going to happen to them, and they're just probably slightly more upfront about the fact that it's a sham, and therefore they're not going to organize their societies in that way, or they don't want to organize their societies in that way, and maybe you can take their word for it that they believed. Well, I've got the quote here: "We believe in our religion both as an ideology and a practice, and hence we tried our best to establish Islamic state and Islamic society." Again, and that just harks back to the aristocratic Greens to me. But it was always sort of bauble dangled in front of people's eyes anyway, in the West, when it was called democracy, when there wasn't anything really being contested. There's no in your terms, Mike, there's no structures there in opposition to sort of test against each other. There's no foundation essentially to either of them. You're just given, it's as we see now, three or however many parties there are now here, all offering the same thing with just slightly different managerial styles, which is of course Curtis's point. But if you can't vote against a thing, you can't vote for a thing, is my view, and that's why it resonates, this sort of security stuff and the green stuff is antithetical to democracy. But you can't test that. You can't test that thesis and antithesis democratically, because that choice isn't extended to you. I've probably strayed from the point there.
Did you want to come in there, Mike? There was something you wanted to say.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, the problem is not democracy itself. The problem is that the problem isn't any specific political ideology necessarily. Some and not all ideologies are created equal. Some are better than others. Some are more toxic than others. I get all that, but the point is that, these guys are talking about American democracy, American freedom. What is democracy? Democracy is an instrument. I see, by the way, a lot of people now on the kind of online, the online activist right, let's call it, saying that, well, actually, you see lefties say it too, that, well, democracy doesn't work, right? Democracy doesn't work. Well, what do you mean it doesn't work? Democracy is an instrument, okay? When I go to my workshop and I want to cut a piece of lumber, I use a circular saw, not a hammer. If I try to use a hammer, then chances are I will get suboptimal results, because that is not the correct instrument. And it seems to me that people, there's a notion in which people will focus on something and they'll construct it wrongly because they have no foundation, and then they'll say it doesn't work because they don't, because they take the instrument for the outcome. Democracy is not an outcome that you aspire to. It is an instrument to hopefully push your society towards certain kinds of outcomes and avoid certain other kinds of outcomes. Again, I see academic agents saying democracy is a lie. Listen, we can skip all that thing about how American democracy is not really democracy and how the politicians don't really work on our behalf. Forget about that for a second. What I'm saying is that, the idea that one should be able to replace one's government, even notionally on a regular basis, is an instrument. Elections are an instrument, okay? What is the outcome? And specifically, the kinds of outcomes that you want to avoid with democracy are the kinds that tend to stack up with monarchies, for example, which is that over time, you get this inbred cabal of leaders who are not answerable to anybody, and the system rots from within. Now, replacing that with a notionally democratic system, or the democratic republic, whatever you want to call it, is not the solution. It is a design decision. It comes with trade-offs. And as an engineer, specifically for myself, it's like I'm just struck by how utopian and how non-informed by kind of just the normal sense that, listen, you're going to build things a certain way, and as a result, you're going to be open to certain defects, and there's going to be less of a tendency for different, but you're going to get defects. The systems will have a non-zero failure rate. That's just life. And there's no perfect political system, but these guys, Sayyid Qutb was a utopian. The Straussians were utopians. Extinction Rebellion, they're utopians, right? It's the same thing, all these climate people. Oh, well, we want to be able to power our civilization, using some energy source that has zero negative trade-offs. Well, good luck with that. These are systems.
With them, those guys, it's more about the form of social organization the mode of production.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Just you must live like
this,
because there are no possibilities of producing a surplus.
Yeah, that's right.
It was literally utopian after Thomas More. It's exactly how he conceived of his little island.
Moving this on to the second episode, actually, the Phantom Victory. I think that's a good sort of link there, because I think there's a very interesting sequence in the episode where you're talking about the getting into the 80s. We're talking about the Reagan Doctrine, seeing the Afghans as freedom fighters. And again, not realizing the U.S. notion of freedom isn't exactly compatible with the sensibility of the society that they are at this time, funding to fight the Russians. And there's some sort of charming clips of the Mujahideen, bombing around the place with Stinger missiles and riding motorbikes and scooters, and they're playing a song by Donovan called "Colors." And interesting lyrics, which I looked up actually afterwards. The lyrics go, I'm just going to paraphrase, well, not paraphrase, I'm going to shorten them. But freedom is a word I rarely use without thinking of the time when I've been loved. So there's this kind of sort of touching romanticism about the U.S. intervention at this point. But he seems to, Curtis seems to certainly strongly imply the U.S. thought that the Mujahideen would bring a democracy, and instead Afghanistan essentially becomes a radical jihadi magnet after that. Yeah. So. What we really find out, though, is at this time, the radicals are saying there's only one solution to this. It's Islam. It's no democracies, no party, no debate. So at the same time, the neocons, are eyeing up other people in the vicinity. They're working with Saddam. Of course, he's still an ally. As we go on, we're noticing things like when we get to the sort of George Bush Senior period, we're seeing that that he was actually sort of a check on the neocon ambition.
Yes.
For a time, rather like Kissinger. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, they wanted the radicalism of the neocons was he was probably aware was too much to bear, and it's quite interesting that it's a small cabal. Both in the Reagan, the sort of formulated the Reagan doctrine, and was then able to assert themselves, partly in reaction to events through the Bush Senior administration, too, and it sort of speaks again to that notion, or the false notion that the neocons were this extremely powerful force, historical tendency, but actually doesn't seem to be the case.
And it seemed like one of their sort of failing gambits actually was to kind of use religion as an expression in the culture wars at this point, wasn't it? In the sort of late 80s, early 90s, when you're coming up to the 92 election. And this relates to a comment you and I talked about, Ben, where you talked about the Straussians as or the neocons as parallel to Marxists here, or using the same methodology of covert radical entryism.
Right, the right wing Marxists, and
do you want to explain a bit more about that?
Well, I think it's to me it's when it's also sort of a reference to Mike's sort of foundationism when once the power, once it becomes about power, and it isn't, I'm more in favor of democracy than some of the people in the comment stream are. but because I agree it's a tool not just for removing people, for testing ideas. Yes. To the extent that they need to be tested. Right? So in a sort of perfect idea, which I understand now why people would reject, there are ideologies established historically with their own traditions and their own way of looking at things. But it seems that what's happened is that those ideologies have fallen apart, they've become tools for that power gaming, essentially, that don't belong to either left or right, or to progress or to reaction. Or reaction as such, and so once that's happened, sort of insights or methodologies that might have been particular to Marxists at a certain point may be deployed by small cabals, like you can be damn sure that those cabals of neocons had read Marx and the rest, and were about using them to their own advantage. They weren't attached to any particular political philosophy that would have found any of that objectionable. So it's all just control levers on a control surface. That's available to them. It's cynical, and that's why I think we can have the broader abstract conversation about democracy, but that's why I would suggest that democracy is a solution to it, or a necessary answer to it in some form, because they were against democracy. They wanted power without accountability. They wanted to create myths for their own advantage.
Correct.
And that we need to throw them out. Sorry, Mike, go on.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but yes, this is 100% right. And by the way, again, people, it's become fashionable to say democracy is a lie, democracy is this, and democracy is one way of organizing human systems. It has drawbacks, okay? It degrades in a certain way. All systems do, all right? Look, it's also become very fashionable among the right, among the left. I say become, but it's been fashionable for quite a while to say capitalism is a lie or capitalism is a failure. Capitalism is a design pattern. That's all it is, okay? Markets, you've probably heard me go off about free market fundamentalists, because that's a thing too. In not having our conservatives not really being conservative, okay? All they've been doing since really the Cold War, since the depths of the Cold War, has been saying rah, 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 markets, free markets. A market is an instrument. It's not a thing that you aspire to. It's a component of something else. Components fail. Here's my basic engineering take on things. Components fail. Systems fail. That's the nature of components and systems. Okay? If you want to, I'd be glad for anyone who says this is a lie or that is a lie or that doesn't work, to come up with a system that has a zero failure rate. It's not going to happen. And someone who is going lateral for a bit, someone who is almost like a philosophical father to me, Stanley Crouch, the late great cultural critic and jazz critic Stanley Crouch, when he talked about America, when he talked about the American experiment, he had a lot of the same problems that we might have with what has become of American democracy and what has become of American politics and what have you. But he was animated by a fundamental love, like a radical humanism, like a radical love of human potential and understanding of what the Constitution was for. He had no illusions that the Constitution was a perfect document, or that it could by itself lead to a perfect society, or that democratic elections, or even notionally democratic elections, would make all men good and happy. He wasn't such a fool. He thought that was simply an instrument, and he talked about it as an instrument that would allow a society to experiment with ideas in a certain way. But everything is a matter of trade-offs, and the problem I have with fundamentalists and utopians is I come back to, it's like they don't understand trade-offs. They're not, maybe to just go on a slight tangent, in foundationism, we talk about foundationism as having three core archetypes. We have a manifesto, it's a 10-point manifesto, but we have three core archetypes. And the archetypes are the forge, the library, and the tower. And the forge is the archetype of practical experience, of putting your hands on the world and making things, right? The blacksmith is the man of the forge, okay? And the library is the archetype of recording and research and study and contemplation. And then the tower is the archetype that represents the contemplation of the moral imperative, why we do what we do. So in the forge, we actually do things. In the library, we research things, we read things, we record what we know, and in the tower we ask why. And it strikes me that all of these takes on this is a lie, this is terrible, this system needs to fall, whatever. They are fundamentally unbalanced because they lack the forged knowledge that says that systems have breaking points, and you're going to see stress fractures here and there, and that's a fundamental, to me, a fundamental foundationist idea, is that civilization is just a house that is always falling down and always being renovated. And you don't have the option of taking the roof off because it's leaking. You have to maintain continuity and balance that with adaptability. Sorry, I'll pause.
No, it's okay. I don't want to get too bogged down in the question of democracy, although I noticed Academic Agents made an offer for you to have a chat with him at some point. So, cool. that presumably still stands. Maybe that would be good. Yeah. What's interesting towards the end of this episode is, for me, it's this moment where you have the breakaway of the Reagan Democrats, because there's a complete failure to read tone and reception on the part of the Republicans, where the people are beginning to be frightened by the fire-breathing evangelical messages that are coming into play here. So there's the very sort of unsubtle frontal kind of attempt to coerce the electorate at that point into socially conservative values, and it's resisted. And this is the gap that you have later, going back to one of his future documentaries, the trap that's filled by kind of Clinton Blair managerialism. This is that sort of inflection point. But it's also interesting as well in this episode. You have Curtis is building very heavily up on the theme, having superseded the Russians as the enemy of Clinton as the so-called fantasy enemy. Now, it's interesting watching this documentary from 17 years ago, where it seems at times Curtis is at pains to almost bend over backwards to say that, all of these stories were kind of groundless. Whitewater was just a property deal that went wrong, and the sexual assault claims were very little to look at. But then there was Monica Lewinsky. Okay, that was a bit scandalous, but essentially it was all neocon kind of dirty tricks brigade stuff, which was being rolled out against Clinton. But isn't it interesting to look back on that now and say, well, perhaps they were onto something about Clinton.
I'm not sure. I saw it and I thought, well, was this sort of drubbing he was getting from Starr and the other lawyers, was that the sort of foreshadowing of the harassment that Trump got, the constant process of impeachments and so on, so like sort of revenge? Well, actually, I don't think that's true, because Trump was quite a different animal to most of the Republican, the Republican, certainly the HQ, I suppose you could call it. And then I think Curtis was sort of putting him in a bit of a sort of victim mode.
Exactly. It was the nobleman under pressure, almost, as it was coming out then. I mean, I remember when Clinton was elected, being at university, and friends of mine were breaking out bottles of champagne, and I found them in the student union lawn, and I said, "Well, what are you doing?" He said, "Oh, we're celebrating because Clinton got elected." I mean,
people have celebrated that man a bit too strongly, haven't they? But we'll find out. I hope in the fullness of time. But I think that what we should just reject that completely. You should just reject whether it's Curtis's intentional framing or not. I think you can say at that point that the neocons and the Clintons, let's just say that they deserve each other. With the benefit of hindsight, they deserved each other. You don't have to. Again, it's opposing. It's false opposition.
Correct. Yes.
And they're just vying. It's Game of Thrones nonsense, isn't it? But it's they're vying for their own opportunities. They're not connected to broader constituencies.
Well, this puts me in mind of something that I have in my notes that I wanted to touch on, which was the thing of the tendency of people to break a good point by pushing it too far. Okay, and that in a way is that ties in with this thing I keep coming back to of illusion versus unreality. Illusion versus unreality. The fact that something is illusory doesn't mean there's nothing there. It means that what is there is not what you think it is. So, for example, some of the attacks on Clinton were, I think, specious. It seemed clear to me, I ran some of the numbers, it seemed clear to me that Whitewater was no big deal, okay? The sexual assault stuff is highly credible, actually. The attacks on his character are credible, okay? He seems to be another example of this type of man who is ambitious and kind of unmediated by virtue. Okay, both things can be true, right? The attacks on him can be dishonest, and he can not be a very nice human being. So this is, and we see this happening again and again. Bringing it up to the current, to the present day, all of us on this chat and very many of the people who listen to our online content or follow our online content probably agree that the response of our governments to the COVID outbreak has been way over the top at best, right? And motivated by all kinds of unsavory things. But then you have people who go even further and say, well, COVID, SARS-CoV-2 is not a real pathogen. It doesn't exist. And it's like, well, again, you're breaking a good point by pushing it too far. This is a real thing. It does make people sick. It's just not Ebola. That's all. And part of the reason why we're in the midst of this mess is because we have governments that we've allowed to amass too much power. We've farmed out too many of the things that we should be responsible for as human beings. Things like mutual care, mutual aid, self-defense, what have you, and we've lost our ability to reconcile with grave and eternal things like time and death. Right. So now we're in this state. That doesn't mean that it's not a real pathogen. And what's funny, going back to the film and going back to specifically the left and right political dynamic at the time that 9/11 happened, is that part of the reason why the neocons got so much traction, ironically, I think, is because the left, was so over the top in their reaction to the government's reaction to 9/11. So that talking about the Gulf War and like no blood for oil, which is a really stupid slogan. It's like there were parts of the left that denied even the moral rectitude of simple retaliation. They thought there were lefties at the time who literally thought that America should just apologize for having caused trouble in the Middle East in the past, as opposed to, no, we're going to find who killed our people. We're going to go get them. And that's, do you get what I'm saying? It's like both sides are kind of, they're kind of veering so wildly off from any kind of rational path that that they're almost, it's difficult for an ordinary person to get a real take on things. And I think most people just lined up behind President George Bush Jr. when 9/11 happened, simply because they were so disgusted by the left. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And
having been so disgusted by the neocons just previously, I think it's
yes.
Well, that's the sort of turning point of the film, isn't it?
I mean, relating it to what you say about, people in the chat asking about, how does this relate to the present situation of the disease crisis? I'm just being careful here for YouTube algorithm purposes. There is something we can talk about in that later, but I think there's one last bit in this second episode I want to get to before we race through the third episode and get to the sort of the meat of Curtis's thesis. Is it was an interesting form of inoculation that happened at this time in Algeria, where the jihadis, as we said, a number of them had returned to their own countries and tried to incite, bottom-up rebellions against the regimes in those countries. And the interesting thing that happened in Algeria was the regime actually infiltrated and the jihadi groups and encouraged them to actually accelerate the killing of ordinary citizens, because obviously this was part of the total terror philosophy the jihadis were following, to such an extent. This is an interesting lesson about how ruthless they were in that particular power regime, to the extent that the people turned against the jihadis. So That's just I think interesting lesson about how your enemies can exploit your purity spiral.
Yes.
And this is something of a lesson for today. But anyway, by the end of the second episode, you've got the Islamists in the late 90s. They've failed to summon the popular revolt, and the neocons have pretty much failed to get Clinton. He goes on, essentially for 8 years in power until the millennium, and things pass over to W. Who pretty much is embracing a kind of a neoliberal agenda from day one, a non-interventionist agenda. He's running on things like tax cuts, but we're on the sort of cusp of the big moment, the big crash here. So we get to episode 3, the shadows in the cave, and we're returning again to the Islamist radicals who are essentially, we're finding out we're actually really fighting for localized or national movements. And then you've got the embassy bombing in Nairobi in 1998, and this is the sort of emergence of Osama bin Laden as a figure in the region. But what happens after that is the key part of Curtis's thesis turns on this thing in 2001, January 2001. The FBI has brought a trial in the case of the Nairobi bombings. And in order to do it under American law, they have to be able to prosecute an organization. So they use the RICO statutes to do this. And they have an informant who's been around bin Laden, and he supplies a whole kind of legend for bin Laden, his activities, and instantiates an organization to allow the prosecution to take place, which gets called Al-Qaeda, essentially. So it's kind of a similar process like you had with Team B, a couple of decades before, where you've got to kind of legitimize the fantasy by some kind of a process of collective formality, whether it's in this case a legal process, a court case, or like a scientific or a technical process like you have with Team B, where they're looking at Russian military capabilities. And yet the contrast is that this is all at complete odds with Osama bin Laden's actual power and his actual effectiveness. Yeah.
Yes.
Go on.
Yeah. There's a lot going on there, right? Again, I
mean, essentially, they were trying to prosecute them with using laws that were designed to prosecute the mafia. So you have to construct a sense of an organization, and this is where the main bit of Curtis' thesis hangs. It's this notion that we're being sold the myth at this time of a kind of a global organization, a bit like Spectre, in James Bond, that has these kind of loyal fight to the death kind of minions and recruits. And at the same time has this sort of sense of darkly, almost supernatural power to threaten our society at an existential level. And this is the prime fiction of the moment.
Right, and this is I don't know if they used RICO, which is a racketeering influenced and corrupt organizations. I know they use conspiracy statute. They might have used RICO as well, but yes, certainly it was under conspiracy law, which says that you don't have to be. You don't actually have to have done anything. You just have to be associated with one of the key conspirators. But yes, this goes back to the thing that I'm always harping on, which is there's a sense of threat magnification. In other words, there is, again, illusion versus unreality. There was something real there. There are actually violent jihadis in all these countries. They can certainly pose a threat to their own countries and to the West, and they have actually mounted kind of terrorist spectaculars here and elsewhere. That doesn't necessarily mean they're this global kind of coherent organization. And then you have this feedback loop of because you were putting all this energy into going after this organization, so to speak, you almost draw it out of you almost draw that organization out of non-existence. Now those people have something to coalesce around, and I just noticed that this is a pattern that happens in certainly in American policymaking. I've seen it again and again and again. People in the chat have been talking about COVID. to just dip into that for a second and to tie that in, we saw that one of the things that the hysterical overreaction to the emergence of this virus caused people to do was it caused policymakers to take the most heavy-handed approach and to take the most top-down approach when a bottom-up approach would have been much better. In other words, in the case of a pandemic, what you want operators on the ground. You want clinicians to be looking at things very closely and making decisions based on the stuff they know, because they're closest to the information, and then slowly that information might percolate up to the levels of kind of state or federal policymakers that could maybe assist. But instead, what we had was top-down thinkers saying, okay, we have to do this. And so, for example, in Italy, one reason why Italy got hit so hard early on in the outbreak is that the Italian policymakers did the worst possible thing.
I think you're getting ahead of the story here, though. I think going to COVID, because I think the interesting discussion there is how the dark fantasy gets projected out, and what I say in those is in those in these kind of debates, when faced with the problem you mentioned earlier, is look, the terrorists were real, the COVID is real, the CO2 is a greenhouse gas,
right?
And what seems to tend to happen then is then the fantasy gets unleashed about what each of those things is, and it was Bill Derodi near the end who's asked if terrorism has been invented, and he says that's too strong a term, and we projected our own worst fears, and that's how the fantasy is created.
There are acts of terrorism, but there are no super powerful baddies. Just like there are moments of weather, but there is no global scale impending disaster.
There's no climate. Exactly. There's climate change. There's no climate emergency. Correct. Exactly.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And you also have a mechanism of a sort of sunk cost fallacy as well. That once you've established the basic lie, I mean, it's a line in Shakespeare. Richard III talks about, but I am in so far in blood that sin will pluck on sin. It becomes at a certain point, as you say, Mike, a set of feedback loops that are political and cultural as well.
Yes.
That make it impossible to sort of get out without a profound loss of faith, which of course is unthinkable for the political class. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and the reason I don't think it's, I kind of see what you mean, Ben, but the reason I don't think it's necessarily getting ahead of the narrative is because this is. Pardon me?
Yeah, no. Getting ahead of the conversation.
Oh, I see what you mean.
You're going.
It'll come in the summary.
Come in the summary. Yeah. But I mean,
we're still talking about episode 3.
Right.
I think that.
But I mean,
to get back to that. Go on, Mike. Sorry, quickly. You go first.
Yeah. Just that I just. And again, this is my kind of software engineer geek side manifesting itself. But it's just I'm always looking at these patterns, and it's like, so right away I say, oh yeah, this is the same kind of thing, right? There's threat inflation, and then there's typically top-down response. Again, because we're talking about how concentrated power responds to these things, and so when you allow too much power to concentrate, when you allow governments to get too big and too powerful, for example, then there is a built-in incentive for governments to overreact because they have the tools with which to react, right? As opposed to allowing local operators to actually figure things out on their own and grapple with the problems. So it's a Katamari ball of badness.
So there's this comment. There was a comment from in the show, not on the stream, from a guy from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Now, if you know these guys,
yep.
You like, they are not they're not ones to what would you say, damp down a scare story. and you know, that they're all over. I mean, you know, they were founded at the idea. You know, their emblem is a clock with like 1 minute to midnight, and you know, and all they do is move the clock between 5 minutes and 1 minute to midnight. That's all they've been doing since their foundation.
Yeah, there's no.
Oh my God. Yeah, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. We're all going to die. We're all going to die.
Yeah.
But and his comment was that the danger is not from the bomb, from a dirty bomb, which is what he's talking about. The danger is from panic, right?
Yes.
And that and like so those conversations, you got like those conversations were being had. Like there was criticism around. They must. When they're making these decisions about the you know, how to construct the response, like so that like you know, it's possible to credit, and I think the film does, in a sense, the whole series does in a sense credit with them with too much agency for having sort of been able to carefully craft stories in order to be able to manipulate people and subvert democracy in this sort of neat way, but they did lose control of things. Both sides of that story lost control of things, but they were aware of the criticisms of these scare stories. So that they must have incorporated them into their thinking. Like they weren't naive to the possibility that a dirty bomb doesn't do anything. The media weren't unaware of the fact that a dirty bomb is probably a useless device.
Yes.
So they, but they all ran with it. The media ran with it, and the politicians ran with it. And I think, and that's got to be taken into account.
I mean, what's interesting from what you're saying, Ben, is it parallels the sequences in this last episode where. You've got this sense of the complete gulf in the size of the problem and the size of the response, the disparity, you know. So the bits of footage where you've got George W. Bush talking about, you know, we thwarted terror in Buffalo, Detroit, Seattle, Portland, Tampa, all Democrat cities, interestingly. But you get this sense of he's kind of looking and thinking, oh my God, do I really have to try and spin this crap, you know, because they sound ridiculous. And then, you know, Curtis goes through all the various cases that were kind of ludicrous, really, for, you know, these sleeper cell cases and so on, where, you know, you've got, on the one hand, there's one case where there's a convicted fraudster who's cut a plea deal with the FBI to amp up the case in some way. And then there's a case in Lackawanna with the Yemenis, who are sort of sending messages to each other about going overseas to attend a wedding, and you know, and the FBI is reading this all as kind of coded language when in fact they are just going to attend a wedding. You know, a kind of a sort of semiotic fantasy begins to take hold, and a linguistic sort of imagination begins to overpower the system when, you know, go on.
They would have been under tremendous pressure to do so. And you know, there's the archetypal, there's the satire of the you know, security forces trying to find to try and discover the plots and thwart them, and you know, all of the guys in the room plotting the next atrocity, bar one, are FBI, right, or Homeland Security, right? So and I don't think that's an unfounded criticism, that there were cases where, you know, quite sad individuals were sort of led to sort of act as you know, plotters, and they were just being led on by pairs of agents, like you know.
The best story was about the four guys who went off to try and join Al Qaeda, who got lost in China.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And Chris Morris did a decent satire on it as well.
Of course, yeah. Well, that emerged from that, yeah.
Yeah.
So we're getting towards the end of this last episode. So it takes the story to the UK, of course. You've got the UK taking up the baton from the US and going into hyperdrive with all the paranoid and legislative instruments being rolled out. You know, 664 people arrested, none of them Al Qaeda. Any convictions under the terrorism laws that were brought in? I mean, do we remember these terrorism laws at the time where you could be, I mean, essentially, you could be banged up for an indefinite period.
Oh yes.
Back in the Blair years, you know, and the only convictions were essentially relating to Northern Ireland. And it's at this point.
And don't forget that there was a young man. I forget his name, but I seem to remember he had a Portuguese or Brazilian sounding name, who was killed by UK security forces in the subway. They just, ran into a train and shot him up.
Jean-Charles Menezes, yeah.
There we go. Yeah.
So, go on. Sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say I remember it very well. I remember I was thinking of doing a website called Time In, because it was things were shut down. I mean, it was a mini lockdown if a lot of people liked it. You couldn't go. I remember I was going. I had calls to deliver something to the estate near Didcot power station in Oxford where I lived, and I just asked the guys on the door. I had some young nieces and nephew at the time, and I thought they could do with. It was a trip that I did for school when I was a kid, and going and looking at the power station before they knocked it all down. I thought would be good for them. So I just popped in and said to the guy on the door, who was quite taken aback and probably he had already summoned security. I said, so do you still do day trip, tours? And say, oh no, because of the present situation. So all these opportunities that were available to us, sort of who grew up in the 70s and 80s, were denied to that generation of children because terrorism. And there was I remember I was filming at just a silly little music video skit not with a full crew or anything, just a tiny little hand cam in the sort of a really run down crappy shopping centre in Oxford, and we got swept on by the security.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Which I mean, we didn't look anything bloody like terrorists. I won't try and describe us, but like kind of we'd been really, really undercover. If but that was all they needed to throw their weight around, was the possibility that the arse end of Oxford, which is not very glamorous, was going to be the site of the next sort of global act of global terrorism.
Well, what's funny about this is I remember, to your point, Ben, I remember that actual train spotters, which at one point were a thing, right?
You have them in the States.
Yeah, we had train spotters, and we're getting shut down. It's like, well, you can't take pictures of trains because terrorism. I remember I've been an aviation geek for a long time. I remember being on a trip overseas, and I was at a small regional airport and taking pictures of aircraft, because they had some small aircraft that I really liked, de Havilland Twin Otters and things like that. And someone came up to me, one of the personnel came up to me and said, "You can't take pictures on an air ramp because terrorism." And what the funny thing is, what is it that people think taking a picture of an in other words, if someone wants to blow up an aircraft, do they really is their ability to do so enhanced by having photographs of it?
Well, this was the reasoning used in some of the American cases, wasn't it?
Yes.
That an innocent tourist video of somebody filming inside Disneyland,
That's right.
Noticing a dustbin was a sort of a cue about where to put a bomb.
Yeah, or they're measuring as the camera's on, and they're walking from one ride to another, and it's like they're counting out the steps, and all it takes is for you to pull back and say, wait a minute, if a terrorist wants to plant a bomb to blow up an amusement, why does he need to count the steps from one place to it doesn't make any sense. But there we have it. Once you allow this is what I mean by the death of virtue, right? Is that so we've come full circle, or we've come around from policy operators who are motivated by ambition without virtue, and now they can have this outsized effect on a population that has not cultivated its own virtue, specifically the virtue of courage, the virtue of fortitude, right? to where the people are only too happy to kind of say yes to everything because they're afraid. And the thing, whether we're talking about heavy weather events or disease or terrorism, there are very many things to be afraid of in the world.
To that point, to that point, exactly, that you say, where the sensibility of people is such that, I mean, by this point, we're talking about having made ourselves hostage to this fear.
Yes.
And you've got people so emptied out of any kind of independent principle or sort of personal moral positioning, that you get this situation where, as at this point in the documentary, Curtis says this is an inflection where the Islamists suddenly realize that they're in a codependency with the elite powers of the superpowers of the West. Yes. It's that moment where something breaks beyond the notion of conspiracy into emergence, where the behavior simply becomes apparent, and that they realize that they can capitalize upon this situation, and they become part of those feedback loops, that reinforce the ongoing 20 years since kind of timeline of this thing. So you get the cultural feedback loops where, like, you've got the stories about the Islamists are watching Hollywood movies for ideas about how to initiate the American apocalypse, blow up the Brooklyn Bridge, and they get these ideas from watching crap like Godzilla. So the liberal system that they're trying to attack is feeding them and the sort of the inspirational means of its demise. Go on, sorry.
So the point of that for me is when Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and says that it's the terrorist network has penetrated 60 countries, and including the USA, and it's got to be rooted out, and the same obviously happened here. And that for me, that's and the parallel is happening in the Islamic world as well, and the neocons, and as we described, they turn against their own country. They turn. That's right. Everyone becomes the enemy. That's when
just like in the total terror strategy of the Islamists themselves, where the people become culpable.
Right.
Yeah, because they're insufficiently. The
Jahiliyyah has penetrated so deeply.
Yeah, so they can all. They're all just. They're all fair game. Right. And it was the same here. I think that, that really beginning of the radical turn against the radical transformation of the relationship between state and individuals, the government and individuals, to really sort of hammer this idea of individualism that was running, the attack on it that was running through the whole story. Now it's really now it's gone full circle. It's complete, and it's saying you are a suspect, and in the same way you are a carbon emitter, you are a transmitter of COVID-19.
And by the way, this echoes right back to the Cold War, or harks right back to the Cold War, right, where there was this, it was a shadow war to begin with, and so we spent that few decades jumping at shadows, right? And everything around the world was, what are the communists going to do here? What's going to happen here? We have to purge, and there were communists in the United States, but it was like, we have to get the communists out of this, and we have to find them because they're lurking, and threat inflation and threat amplification. Go on, sorry.
Peter Hitchens has a really good point on this, and he says that the difference then is that in the West, the governments had to sustain a notion of liberty and democracy in order to have some to ballast against what appeared to be happening in the USSR.
Interesting.
So like they could never. There were the security forces and they were very aggressive, but it was always kept in check by the necessity of providing an image that was opposite to the other, and that was limited, obviously, to into, if you want to be lefty about it, you say consumer capitalism or something. But nonetheless, we had radical trots and lefties of all flavors were free to operate in the West in the way that they weren't in or the counterparts weren't in the Soviet bloc.
Yeah.
So we had to have an illusion of political diversity and liberty and so on here. So they couldn't go too far in the way that they did under the logic of the post 9/11 stuff.
Yes.
There's more liberty under the Cold War, where there was an extant threat of annihilation at any moment in theory. There's more liberty then in the West than there was seemingly when we were at war with men in caves.
And having come out of the Cold War, because Western politics, particularly American politics, was characterized by this kind of oppositional fallacy. What it meant was that we didn't come out of that shadow conflict with political parties that actually represented anything domestic, that actually correctly described the divisions in American society, because that hadn't been their focus. And again, they had destroyed their own ability to reason about things. Well, look, fear does that. Fear, if unmediated by the virtue of courage or fortitude, destroys your ability to reason.
And it was also an element, I mean, again, going back to Curtis, that he touches on in The Trap, where Cold War thinking in America was very much propagated by the advancement of game theory, of the cynical expectation that your opponent is always going to do the wrong thing. And that is always going to modulate your response into one that is, I suppose, is how can I put it, is less about your individual altruism and more about your expectation of hostility from others. And so politics, as you say, becomes kind of sort of shrunken down by these sort of arithmetic laws that begin to be formulated about, well, what's the expected Soviet response, and then it goes on into things like developing the metrics of things like the body count. How do we tell how well we're doing within this constrained system of poker face that's being adopted as an international policy system? But the interesting thing I want to pick up on what you guys was just saying then was this notion of the clamping down on individual freedoms, I suppose you could say, in the West at this time, and this instantiation of this kind of surveillance state that has resonance now, was the way, although that kind of suppressed individual agency and liberty, it did, as Curtis says here, that the sort of the whole fantasy element built up about the enemy transformed politics, and it renewed it with a sense of the heroic in political leaders, and it elevated figures like Tony Blair, for instance, beyond being mere kind of managers, beyond being sort of focus group triangulators, and it gave them a sense of higher calling. So at this moment, they could say, like Blair did, I think, in a clip in one of the parts, he's talking about the terrorist threat. It all feels a bit sort of nebulous, but he says, "But I really do believe it." Then it's, and I think, Ben, you've talked about this, isn't it? It's the sort of the sincerity of his anxiety then becomes the metric by which you judge his effectiveness as a leader.
So yeah, and I think he's talking to. The blob, the establishment, so to speak, rather than speaking about a broader sort of rediscovery of his political authority, right? Because actually, what happens under Blair is that people stop voting. Like, it's the first, Blair's election is the first time, I don't know whether it's the first or the second election, but it's the first time since, well, at least since the Second World War, which is the time I've looked, it's the first time in history that more people didn't vote than voted for the winning party, right? So none of the above is the winner in under Tony Blair, and a lot of anxiety starts to emerge about from the political establishments, like, people are no longer engaged with politics. So the idea of the hero. They certainly, and their their fans in the establishment certainly presented Bush and Blair as sort of Churchillian, standing against, they try and draw these analogies with World War II, which would just fell flat on their face.
And it's obvious that Blair has been a hero figure for the Conservative Party ever since, hasn't he? Because of his effectiveness, the Dark Lord's skills, are something to aspire to, not to.
And ones which the actual Churchill clone doesn't seem able to summon up either, like that.
No.
Or certainly he's exhausted them very quickly. But so I was. So people have been talking about monkey dust earlier on in the comments.
What is that?
Now, actually, Mike, if you haven't seen it, it is the most acute dissection of the Blair era that it's possible to do. But it's a cartoon. Okay. It's a cartoon, and it's an extremely cynical cartoon about the nature of politics in that era. It's just dark as hell, basically, and it's just comically bleak statement about how people relate, and got from everything from Blair's sort of hollow speeches and vapid promises through to what's happening at dinner parties in North London, and they're bizarre, but they sort of eat a tramp. When one of the dinner parties, they said, "We've got this trap," and like the sort of the class of people that are doing very well out of the Blair years are sort of, "Oh, isn't this wonderful?" Which are very much in part based in that part of London. But so you've got to look at it, and I've realised I've gone off on a spiel that I don't know what I was talking about.
No, that's all good. I mean, what we're on the cusp of here is the part of the documentary where they're talking about this emergence of what they call the paradigm of prevention, and the idea that the loss of individual rights is the price that society pays for safety. They talk about this. He talks about the famous triple negative statement of the precautionary principle, Ben, which you will obviously be able to speak to. This idea that not having evidence is not a justification for not taking action.
That's
right?
Bill D'Arodi again, isn't it?
That's Bill
D'Arodi talking about. So that's and he flags it up, and this is where I love about Curtis's films, where where the green left sort of watch him, and then they must sort of quietly turn it off and go and watch something else, because he's quite damning of the green movement. The precautionary principle is the innovation of the green movement in the 1980s. He attributes it to global warming, but actually the proper attribution is to the Montreal Protocol. That's the first instantiation of the precautionary principle, designed to protect the ozone layer. There wasn't actually any very good evidence of the effect of CFCs on the ozone layer, but the action was taken all the same on the basis of the precautionary principle. It literally says the lack of full scientific evidence shall not be used to. I forget the quote, so I won't try. But then anyway, so that's how I think that the two interesting things about that, apart from the broadening out of the precautionary principle through to international relations or foreign policy, but it also, and I think this is the sort of the turning point that sort of more speaks to what has happened since, is the internationalization of fear-mongering. Mm-hmm. So the precautionary I mean, as Bill D'Arodi points out in the film, anything can be justified on the basis of a story that has no ground in reality. And it looks, and this is what I'm talking about, people taking the the Power of Nightmares or the the critique of biopolitics, taking it as instruction manuals. And that very much seems to be the way that all global political institutions have been organized since. And there's a really telling point. It's not actually in the film, but I'll talk about it anyway. After the Soviet Union has collapsed in 90-ish, whatever, 1989, right? There is one edition of the United Nations Human Development Report which is going, now we can get on with the agenda. Now we can, in a good way, right? Now we can get rid of poverty. Now we can eradicate diseases. Now we can irrigate people. And they're saying this is a moment of optimism, contra sort of Francis Fukuyama's sort of bleak weirdness, right? So and then within a year, the Human Development Report is just more bleak than it's ever been. And in fact, and it's full of global warming.
Yeah.
Global warming just turns up like that the moment the Soviet Union collapses. And it looks like all these institutions that have been established, during the Cold War, have really, really starting to mourn the loss, and that they need some reorientation. And so I think that's where this sort of political innovation really comes from. That they're all at a loss. Like, there's all this infrastructure, there's all these institutions that have all been established around the principle that tomorrow might never happen, and then they're deprived of their raison d'etre, and that's got to leave some inertia or momentum, whichever one you want.
Well, this leads me to the other thing I wanted to talk about, which was scale. I mean, fundamentally, again, as I look at this stuff, as I watch The Power of Nightmares, I'm always thinking about, again, what are the attack patterns? What are the attack surfaces? What can we do concretely to act against this tendency? Because this is a tendency of these kinds of systems. Earlier, one of you mentioned global organizations that have been organized to fight poverty. If you think about what poverty is and how complicated it is, how complicated the causes can be from one region to another, never mind from one country to another. If you know that from a very kind of street level way, the way someone like my man Nick Buckley from Manchester knows it, because he's been on the streets talking to marginal people. If you know that, then the idea of a global poverty fighting organization is ridiculous on its face. And it seems to me that in general, because we've farmed out, just as societies in the West in general, we've gotten soft, we've gotten lazy, we've farmed out so many fundamental responsibilities to government, to the state. What that has meant is that the state has grown larger, the state has taken on these responsibilities, the state does very many things badly as a result because it's overstretched. There's simply too much money, there are too many people, and they're too distant from the problem. This is an echo of what Hayek said about planned economies. Planned economies fail because the people doing the planning are not where the information is. That's this problem as well. And it just strikes me that if there's one thing to take away from all this, it is that scale is at or near the root of the problem. If you have much smaller bureaucracies, and fewer bureaucracies for that matter, then they simply don't have the ability to spin these fantasies and to throw them up on a big screen and get everyone on board with that.
And you've abstracted the targeting to such hidden and unseen enemies that it becomes impossible to do it, because at the same time you've tethered those hidden enemies to a sense of absolutely apocalyptic stakes.
Yes.
So
yes.
it's impossible to take them on at a sort of a localized, or any level indeed, that makes sense in quotidian politics, because
that's correct.
You've poisoned the well already.
That's correct. And by the way, the defect you just mentioned to those organizations is a benefit, because if it's a problem that can never be solved, then it's like, well, we just got to keep doing more of whatever, which transitions to we got to keep approving these budgets, and we just got to keep going. And bureaucrats will always seek to justify their own existence. But when you let these things get too large, again, they start literally, they're like cities, they create their own weather patterns. And that's a problem. So, yeah.
And intangibles like poverty or climate or terrorism, what they call abstract nouns.
Yeah, yeah.
They are a gift to bureaucracies.
Correct.
You can, like, the global issue is the best kind of issue for for a bureaucracy to try and confront. Because what is your metric? How do you measure success?
That's right. And they're always saying, global global problems require global solutions. That is precisely wrong. Again, we have too few people in the analyst classes, or I say too many people in the analyst classes don't have any forge about them. They have no practical, because people who do real things for a living understand that global problems almost always require local solutions. So I'll pause there, but you were going to say something, Sonny.
I was interested in the idea of these abstract problems and the coping mechanisms that have also evolved out of it. It's just I'm thinking out loud slightly here, but the idea of of obviously at the moment with the disease situation, we've also got a sort of a massive conspiracy scene as well around that,
yes.
and there's a sense in which, let me see if I can go with this, but it's almost like it's almost like a completely rational act psychologically to have that conspiracy scene. It's like a mirroring of the kind of situation you have with the elites, with Team B, sort of inverting the truth about the Soviet Union. The fact that we can't detect their submarines must mean that they've got some really special equipment or something like that. And conspiracy, for, if you like, the populist masses is a way of a psychological anchoring where you have a little bit of control still. In some sense, you're dispossessed from the political space by this kind of managerialism and this kind of instrumentalizing of fear, that you create your own kind of little world of ominous takes in conspiracy, and you can actually control that. So in a sense, it's almost like a kind of benign tumor that grows on the side of all of this stuff as well. It's maybe kind of like a sort of almost like an immune response.
Well, I would say, I see what you mean. I like that. I like that analogy. I would liken it more to the tendency of people to believe elaborate conspiracy theories is a side effect of a human cognitive superpower, which is pattern detection and scenario spinning. Like we are the pattern creatures. That's what makes us apex creatures in nature in the first place. We're very, very, very good at doing this.
It's almost like it's almost spiritually though, like striking back at this system in a way. It's like a kind of an existential self-defense at some level, at hitting back at this system where you're being told lies, and let's make up our own kind of vagaries now, and we'll kind of we'll inhabit that space instead, because it's as much a truth as the nonsense that you're being spun.
Well,
so it's a bit like sort of you're suggesting it's a bit like sort of sticking your feet in and not being drawn into that, rather than a.
Yeah, it's a negative response rather than a positive response. I mean, look, I would say this, that I'm not sure I'm with you there, only because the people like today in the online ferment, for example, about COVID, it's the very people, or really about government overreaction and government overreach. It's the people who are most conspiratorially minded who are also least motivated to actually do any real things. That's the problem I have. It'd be one thing if the conspiracy theorists were all saying, okay, and now we're going to go and do this, we're going to do this, how are we going to, let's get a game plan together, let's blah, 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 blah. But that's not what's happening. The people who are saying, who have most gone down the quote-unquote rabbit hole are the same people who are saying, yeah, it's all you. It's in other words, it seems to serve them as an excuse not to do anything.
To pull out of the political process.
Exactly. To pull out of it, not just of the process in general, just to pull out and just not do anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Ben, you were going to say something.
Well, I've written a bit about conspiracy theories lately, because there are a number of new outfits sort of born out of the wake of extremism and sort of slowly morphing as, the mission creep thing, as the government's priorities have sort of changed from terrorism to COVID and climate. And so they're sort of working double time with quite large budgets to sort of try and synthesize some hypothesis about what drives us, recalcitrants. So they build these complicated webs of our interactions on Twitter and YouTube and so on and so forth, and they're sort of they're essentially just really supercharged smearmongering outfits, but born out of the kind of the behavioral insights team, the nudge unit, and sort of way of looking at things, of trying to control. We did have an agreement, by the way, listeners, that we would not use the word narrative, but it does apply here. That there's an attempt to sort of control narratives, by studying the way ideas sort of propagate and through the internet. Anyway, that's a bit of a round way of round the house's way of saying what I'm trying to get at. So the founder of the nudge sort of philosophy, Cass Sunstein, also did a lot of work on conspiracy theories for the same reason. He wants to be able to delimit public conversations about important subjects, terrorism, climate being the two obvious ones, and so he did a lot of didn't do a lot of research. He did some very superficial research, and he talks about how terrible it was that people weren't believing the terror plot, the narrative around 9/11 that was getting out of control. So he said people in New York didn't believe it, and people in the Islamic countries that were the targets of the war on terror didn't believe it. They had other ideas about who had done it, and the big point that he misses in his research is that, and it's there, but he doesn't pick up on it, is that anomie drives conspiracy theorizing. The disconnect between the political establishment and ordinary life is what create. You can see it statistically, and no shit, right? If you're a New Yorker, and you probably relate to this more than me, but this massive thing just happened that has never been experienced domestically before, a domestic attack. And people are going to ask, well, where the hell were you? Where the hell were the security services? And that's going to naturally lead to other theories about why that happened, or why it was allowed to happen. And ditto in Muslim countries who may have had another idea about what was driving the war on terror, similarly would have had their lives were being turned upside down. So essentially what the Cass Sunstein and the nudgers and the COVID class and the climate aristocracy want is to have their cake and eat it. They want to be able to have failed to deliver what people need, and to be able to say these people are idiots who don't know what they're talking about.
This very much ties to another thing that I was, that seems to trail on from The Power of Nightmares, in fact, and goes back to the earlier documentary, The Century of the Self, where the insight there is Edward Bernays bringing in the work of Freud to determine in commercial terms, let's say, how you sell more goods to people, where he realizes that the model of consumption up to that point has simply been based on utility. And the way, in fact, in which you can keep the capitalist process going and reinventing itself is to sell people products based on the added value they will gain in their life from having the product. So it's the idea of you're not selling them the car, you're selling them the dream that goes with the car. And simultaneously, this is the period in which they'd also learned that you weren't just selling people the crisis at a realistic scale, you were selling them the nightmare. So you've got the kind of double whammy of, fear and consumption in a kind of, yin yang feedback loop that kind of is perfected at this moment.
Well, and this is an effect, I think, of governments that are at once too large and too ineffectual. I should say institutions, not just governments, right? Institutions that are at once too large and too ineffectual, and are ineffectual in part because they are so large, because they try to do so much. And again, going back, I'm always kind of trying to circling back to practical, to getting a practical handle on things. It seems to me that one thing that's important for the people who care about this stuff, trying to rebuild our societies, trying to prevent these elites from taking us down with them, because they're obviously trying to commit suicide, our elites, is to reconnect, to become radical again, to get down to the roots of what the proper relationship of the state and the citizen is, what the uses of democracy are, what the uses of market economies are. But that's going to take a lot of work, because we have got to get out of kind of radical materialism back to purpose and meaning. And it's like it's very easy for us to kind of allow someone else to define overarching fear as the meaning of life if we don't have if we lack that meaning ourselves.
This is the thing that I think it's Girodi again, isn't it? He says towards the end, this notion that the society that believes in nothing is terrified by those that believe in something.
Exactly. Correct. Correct.
Yeah. So I mean, kind of I think we've gone through the documentary in its sort of substance and in its kind of the way it obtains to the present situation, the notion of the confected threat and thereby the acquisition to political elites of a power that seemingly offers a sort of, it's almost a nuclear reactor of endless kind of control. I just thought we'd kind of sort of roll up a bit towards just looking at the documentary itself, maybe stylistically, impressions of it. I mean, there are things about this particular Curtis documentary I think are interesting in that they do. I think to me, one could sort of do a deeper analysis of word by word and gesture by gesture. But there's certainly things that reveal to me that Curtis is far more of a liberal than I am, certainly, and that there are certain. I mean, interestingly, there are certain sort of stylistic differences between a lot of the stuff that you associate and think of with Curtis actually isn't so much in The Power of Nightmares. It's actually a relatively straight telling for him. I think a lot of the kind of favorite sort of tropes that he does as he goes on, the sort of endless corridors stretching away and, 1960s computers spinning around and retro Americana and, people looking alienated and politicians looking shifty while they're waiting for the camera to start an interview, that kind of stuff is not so much here. And it's interesting how the way he uses the footage as well, he kind of sort of favors a kind of God's eye view of everything. He's kind of either floating through urban landscapes between buildings, or he's panning across sort of massed, uncomprehending, leaderless faces of people, and what they refer to as the bewildered herd in the Century of the Self.
Yeah.
And he sort of he very much is very emphatic about how we're all terribly frightened and we've lost grip of the narrative.
Yes.
And he sort of he's often hinting at or bemoaning the kind of lack of solutions coming from the left, very often. He's often sort of saying, this is, well, certainly in interviews he's had since, he's been very much hinting that, why hasn't the left come up with anything? And it's this thing. I mean, Academic Agent was chatting on a stream to Keith Woods today. He's a dissident right thinker, and he was very much talking about the way that liberals, they always, I can't remember how he put it, but they're always embedded within their own worldview, and they never interrogate, he said, the narrowness of that. They never kind of want to look at the possibility of a solution coming from the right, for example. It's always that, the left has run out of ideas, therefore we're in a crisis, But hang on, what's all this stuff over here? We're not even looking at it,
Yeah, I would agree with that, except I would go farther than that. I would say the problem with the right is that it's the worldview it is always embedded in seems to be that of markets as God. Like to the left, the state, the institution is God. To the right, the the market is God.
Those have been the dominant voices in the mainstream. That's for sure. Yeah,
and that's been my entire complaint. Again, going back to the Cold War, and both of those things are wrong. And that's the problem.
The moral right has been somewhat submerged for some time and has not been allowed to come up for air.
Well, going back to the documentary, I think I was talking to a Christian friend of mine a while ago who was saying about that period where the televangelists kind of became prominent, what have you, and he was saying, again, as a believing Christian, he was saying, and I agreed with him, that he thought that was a huge error on the part of American Christendom. It's like that they should never have gotten into bed with the state the way they did. It was a huge problem. They destroyed much of their credibility. Much of what they had to say in retrospect made sense, but by kind of infecting themselves with the disease of scale, okay, and by tying themselves to a lot of other political agendas that a Christian should at least want to stop and take stock before co-signing with, they did themselves a huge disservice. So I think we're always coming back to the sense of to me anyway, to the sense of meaning and to the problem of human relationships and human civilization. I think you recently used the term bewildered, which is a very interesting term, because the classical meaning of bewildered is turned out into the wilderness. You are outside of civilization. You've left the structure. And it seems to me that a radical reinvestment in the structure from the foundation up is going to be something like what we need. Sorry, I'll pause.
Yeah. Go on, Ben. You're going to say something.
I was, and then I was caught up in what Mike was saying. I think I was going to go on about how, I'm not sure if this speaks to your discussion about the stylistic content of the film, but what Mike is saying is essentially fear. These and you mentioned the moral right, but I'd counter on the sort of the emotional left, and maybe maybe we could hypothesize an emotional right, and the only way really that's the limits of any possible conversation. Well, it's not even a conversation anymore. It's more of a transmission from the state, as it were, to the rest of society. Is just it can only be fear because of the nature of what you've just been discussing, right? That configuration of institutions so far apart from meaning as such. So essentially, as meanings are whittled down and destroyed by that distance. The only thing you've got to do, you're able to do is to fearmonger.
Yes, 100%.
Whether that's
and to sort of desiccate the locus of authority in some way as well, because one interesting takeaway I had from this was looking at how many clips of you had of like experts and pundits.
Yes.
Actually, probably weren't that many clips. Actually, it's probably my memory playing tricks. But there were experts and pundits sort of like being interviewed on BBC TV, or the classic one with Donald Rumsfeld talking about, oh sure, they've got these underground bunkers, with ventilation systems and computers, and you can drive tanks in there. And there was some clips I think on a BBC program of someone being extremely certain about the terrorist threat, to an extent that kind of looks ridiculous now. And I think that one of the nice things was how it undermined the plausibility of TV pundits.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
In the certainty of their pronouncements.
That's right.
I'm so torn on that, and I'm so torn on the idea of people being just either sort of just withdrawn from it or bewildered or whatever. I'm very reluctant to make judgments about the public's view, how they receive it or how they respond to it. But in counter that, I remember at the time, but I think it must have been 1999. One of my housemates, who she's pretty posh, so she probably wouldn't, so probably exclude her from the hoi polloi. But we were watching the Hans Blick and Co. Was Blick or Blix?
Hans Blix.
The
Hans Bricks.
Hans Blick. Yeah, and say it again. Let me get it right. Bricks.
Hans Blix.
Hans Blix. Okay, right. Yeah, bricks, blick, bleck. I don't know what it is.
I'm doing the
Anyway,
Team
so-
America pronunciation. Sorry.
Okay, right. So,
Blick.
I you know, and I was cynical from about foreign policy since Gulf War One, but this was, you know, this is about a good 7 years later, and out of my childhood into my early adulthood. But and I remember we were sat on the sofa, and I said, "Oh, I don't know, bollocks." And my housemate's comment was, well, of course they've got WMDs. They wouldn't be looking for them if they didn't exist.
Wow.
Again, yeah, it's back to the Team B reasoning, isn't it?
Wow,
You know,
yeah.
the absence of evidence ensures that there must be evidence.
Yeah.
And
that's right.
and you know, and then when I try and protest, you know, like well, look, you know, roll it back a bit. You know, what get to grips with the logic of your own claim. And then she said, well, you're just playing with words now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yes.
So I'm not sure on the question of how it's received.
Well, you know what you I've had interchanges like that with people about a variety of topics, you know, for years. You know, that one and others, right? You know, climate hysterics, same thing. COVID bedwetters, same thing. And in all these cases, I mean, what I keep coming back to when I think about the kind of the almost the ridiculousness of it is that this is what it is like to talk to someone who is in a panic. That's
Right.
what that's like. You know, well, we just got to do something. Well, hold on a second. Do what? You know, do you know enough about the baseline situation to know what the game plan should be? Can you interrogate the game plan? And again, this whole thing of farming out. You know, in the Foundation of Society, we have a private chat room that I run in my data center, and one of my people over there, Abigail, we're always talking about this thing of farming out. You're farming out things. You're farming out defense. You're farming out education to quote unquote experts. This is a general problem that we have, and you know, states that are overly large and ineffectual and full of elites who are morally and intellectually exhausted are only too happy to take advantage of that. For example, I mean, in a nation that really had its stuff together, I mean, here, like, for example, in the United States, we have a Second Amendment where we have the right to keep and bear arms. So here's the thing, you know, the state might have said, like a sensible state might have said, listen, there are some people around the world who might be coming here to fuck our shit up. So we should, you know, we encourage the states to facilitate local militias. Here's where you can get training. Here's where you can get information. Here's where you can you know, and you would have ended up prompting ordinary citizens to be more vigilant, to perhaps arm themselves and train themselves and just be better at being in the world and acknowledging that this is a threat you have to live with, but here's what we can actually do about it. We meaning the people. But increasingly, over the past few decades, it's been all about what we, the governors can do about it. And so and what I'm always telling people is, you know, God save us from politicians with ideas. Jesus, you know,
So
we hired you to run a machine.
You're drawing a parallel. I mean, you're not studying it as a parallel, but the sort of the thing that's been on the news the last few weeks has been the Rittenhouse. You're saying,
Yes, sir.
Like, and the sort of American conversation is about whether to go our silly route, which is you have to stand there while people beat you up,
kill you, exactly.
and rob you.
Correct.
And then then eventually a policeman will turn up and sort it all out for you. But you may be dead, or you may be dispossessed of
right.
belong.
Right.
But you've retained the moral high ground, being dead.
Yeah, that's right. Because you did the right thing.
You did the right
waiting
thing.
for the
Exactly.
state.
That's the British approach.
Right. And conversely, by the way, you mentioned, because yes, I did actually have the Kyle Rittenhouse case in mind, because what struck me was not just the out and out rank dishonesty of the left in that case, but also the kind of the is minging a word? Minging, the kind of the kind of mealy mouth, kind of like acquiescence of some people on the right to the idea that he shouldn't have been there in the first place, or that he only had a quote unquote right to be there if he had some local connection to the community, which is nonsense. He's an American citizen. And if a mob is trying to destroy an American city, then American citizens who have the time and the wherewithal should show up with weapons and defend themselves and defend their city.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? From the point of view of fear mongering.
Yes, sir.
That the emotional left again is terrified. Is whipped up into a frenzy about the notion of even here. That you got the weirdo Marxist Paul Mason writing about how this gives the trial verdict gives a license to militias to go and shoot anti-racists. Like the fear script has been really refined there. The fear is not apparently hordes of rioters setting fire to your city.
Exactly.
It's the far right. What?
Right.
This guy, this is a boy with a gun, was not the far right. Was not.
Right.
So it's like kind of this mobilization of angst and fear in complete distinction to the facts.
Well, that's correct.
To the facts.
And listen, you can use fear. It's not like fear is not a useful emotion. It is, but you have to channel it towards something constructive. And that's the problem with the left and the right, as I see it in my country right now, is that the left is not interested in human ability because they've placed all their faith in the state. And the right seems to only be interested in the human ability to buy things, to participate in markets, because they don't know what markets are for. And so you have the left saying that, well, he shouldn't have been there. The open borders left saying he shouldn't have crossed state lines. now borders are good again, I guess. Okay, but then you have the right, instead of the right taking up the mantle and saying, something, this is a fundamental duty that young American men have. This is a fundamental duty that American men have to defend their cities. Now that would have been something for them to say. Because they have no problem. They have no problem with lionizing law enforcement and lionizing the military and saying, God bless our men and women who serve in the military. Well, something. It is, if you get together with a bunch of young men of good character and sound mind, and you get a game plan together and you act with virtue, that is an armed service.
Right.
But the right isn't interested in that for some reason. I wonder why.
Just want to bring this back then to so I think we're sort of getting towards a winding up point here, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
Towards back to the Power of Nightmares. The couple of key quotes again. I think the one that we started with, though, Curtis saying, "But the fear will not last, and just as the dreams that politicians once promised turned out to be illusions, so too will the nightmares. And then our politicians will have to face the fact that they have no visions, either good or bad, to offer us any longer." Any thoughts on that, given where we're at now?
Yeah, that was a naive statement, wasn't it? That was wishful thinking, or maybe he had a longer time frame in mind. But I think I mentioned it earlier. I think it's fear has become global. That's become the ideology. It's it's instituted through the UN and all its agencies, and it's defined the nature of the domestic governments under the logic of global institutions, responses to COVID. And I think it's going to deliberately so as well. Like, they knew, and this is from Laura Dodsworth's book, they knew that people had a total misconception about the fatality rate of COVID infections, but like 100-fold or some such.
At least 100-fold.
People believed that 10% of people had been killed, or more than 10% of people had been killed by the disease, and the government ran with that. So I think there's a lot more work to do to start unpacking.
Yeah. Given the number of PPE contracts they issued, and the number of billions of pounds they issued on tracking apps, I think another quote of Curtis at the end of the show captures that. But no one questioned this fantasy because increasingly it was serving the interests of so many people.
Well, we did.
Yeah, exactly. Ironically, it was serving the interests of so few people. I mean, in total numbers, right? The numbers of people. I mean, how big is the neocon? How many neocons are there in a country of 1/3 of a billion people? So I like Ben's take on it. I would say that, I mean, Simon, you mentioned vision, that he talked. I think he said, I don't remember the exact quote, but talking about a vision or vision as held by politicians.
Yeah.
Increasingly, what I arrive at, the conclusion I arrive at, is God save us from politicians with visions. Visions are not.
On the other hand,
well, wait a minute. Let me just hear me out. Vision is supposed to come from the people. It's not supposed to come from politicians. Politicians, again, government is an instrument. It's not an end state. It's just a tool. It's a necessary evil. And the people who run our government are people we've hired to run a machine to do specific things. And this is especially true in America. We have a constitution that lays out the idea of a limited government with enumerated powers. I think that we have to, if anything, one of the things this tells us is that we really have to get about the business of taking back on board the responsibilities that we've decided to farm out. Now, no one can do that for us. And the good news is we don't have to wait for a government to tell us it's okay to do that. We can just do it. Okay, and it starts from kind of this a radical stance, a foundational stance, a rooted stance of these are my responsibilities as a citizen, as a human being. Okay, as a creation, if you like, and then everything else has to be downstream of that. At the end of the day, we're talking about a very small number of people, the government of any country, and they simply cannot govern the population without the population's consent. So this war that we're in, this spiritual war, this soft war, as we call it in the Foundation of Society, it will not be won on the basis of quote unquote convincing people they've been lied to, although that's always good. It's not going to be one on the basis of relating the correct set of statistics. It's not going to be one on the basis of this or that political party winning or losing an election, although that can help or hurt us. This will be won or lost on the basis of meaning as it resides in individuals and families and communities. And that's what I think.
Well, there you go. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And to the chat, the audience, thank you very much for tuning in. I think we've had a very interesting discursus on this particular Adam Curtis documentary. Maybe there'll be more. I'd like to think that other people might take up or challenge some of the points we've been making and take it further. But for now, any last words, Ben, Mike?
Yeah, thanks. No, it's good. I'm happy.
Don't forget to plug what you're working on. You've got some stuff out and some things in the works. Do you know?
You go, Ben. Shill your stuff.
Oh, shill my stuff. Well, I've just done a series of live streams on the COP nonsense, the COP26 nonsense. You can check that out. There's going to be a few more coming up between now and Christmas, but not entirely sure when, because work is quite demanding, and so is podcasting and live streaming. So follow me on Twitter. I think if it's not in the description, Climate CLIM8 Resistance. Cheers.
Carbon Mike, where can we find you?
Before we talk about where to find me, is your website still active? climate-resistance.org, Ben?
Yeah, were you having problems?
I just want to say to people that they should also check you out at climate-resistance.org, climate-resistance.org. And I think the name of your YouTube channel, hey, you got an actual real name for your YouTube channel, youtube.com/climate resistance. So, and I'll just tell everyone who's listening that Ben's conversation with Martin Durkin was awesome. And there was also one with Rupert Darwall, which was amazing. So yeah, great stuff, and everyone should check that out, and everyone should be following Ben at Climb number 8 Resistance on Twitter. As for me, my Twitter handle is Future Radiocast. But the where the action is really the Foundationist website and the Foundationist Society private chat room, which is it's censorship proof. It's a social media platform, but it's small, it's local. I run it in my own data center, and it's invitation only. But I'm pretty liberal in terms of with handing out invitations. And my website, the Foundationist Society website, is www.futurerad.io. Drop by, check out our manifesto, check out our Wall of Fame. Drop us a line, drop us a comment on the contact page. We've got some issues of our monthly periodical, Cornerstone, that's also available there, and some episodes of the Dangerous Space podcast on the podcast page. So yeah, that's it. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in.
What about Simon's podcast?
I've got minimally important stuff. I am on Hector Drummond's channel on the Guff Stream, which is every Friday at 5 minutes past 1. Follow, subscribe, like, share Hector Drummond on YouTube. I have my own podcast called The Difficult Second Album. It's been enjoying a bit of a hiatus recently, but I'll be back and doing some more live streaming in the next couple of weeks. I hope to be perhaps speaking to some interesting YouTubers out there who may have been watching this evening. And in the meantime, I'm on Twitter at Simon__Roberts. Welcome all of your feedback and your criticism as well. This has been a little bit fly by the seat of the pants tonight in terms of digesting quite a lot of notes to follow the series, but I'm glad you've tuned in. I hope it's been interesting. But if you do have anything you want to put at me, just fire it over to me on Twitter, either by DM or an insulting tweet is what I usually prefer. And hopefully we can maybe talk more. I would like to do more stuff about Adam Curtis in the future.
Absolutely.
And if anybody wants to join and do that, I would very much like to chat about his whole oeuvre. I haven't forgiven him for his last documentary, which is I Can't Get You Out of My Head. I think Ben Pyle is his natural heir, and he will go on and do far greater things than Curtis is now capable of. He's had his best years. He's had his seasons in the sun, and now it's his Pirate's Twilight. And Ben is sailing into hoving into view with a completely a new form of
we've got a project
water
together.
Documentary. Yes,
haven't we?
We may indeed. More of that anon.
The crimson climate resistance sails into the sunset. Yeah. Well, also
Absolutely.
by the way, I'd like to thank you for moderating this discussion. It's been a lot of fun, and time flew by. So thank you.